that he's done with Blueprint, with the supplements, with the lifestyle.
I try to ignore it.
Why?
I just have no interest.
Okay, that's interesting. It seems to me, I spent a little bit of time with him. He's been on the show, and I spent a bit of time with him in Honduras. And I think he's kind of like, the way I've come to conceptualize what he's doing for certain areas of the longevity movement is kind of like a scout in an army. It wouldn't do to have an entire army of scouts, but I'm totally fine with someone doing something kind of experimental and maybe dangerous, maybe not dangerous, whatever, and sort of going up to the rocky cliff edge and looking out over the top and then coming back and kind of telling us what they've learned. But I'm both glad that I'm not a scout, and also I don't think it's necessarily in everyone's interest to also be one too. But it's interesting. I asked him a question saying, is he afraid of death, given that almost everything that he's doing is focused on not dying? How much, from your perspective, do you see the longevity movement overall and biohacking and health hacking and stuff being a kind of rehabilitated death denialism, fear of death movement?
I mean, that's a great question. Because I don't consider myself part of that movement, I don't want to speak for it. I don't really know. It's probably best to ask those who firmly put themselves as leaders of the movement. I know that I'm probably just as afraid of death as anybody else. I don't want to represent that I'm some monk here who's so at one with the universe that he can't wait to die. I don't want to die. And by the way, I think it's less a fear of death and more a fear of not being here. That's the part that we can't really contemplate, because you and I don't have a conception. Nobody listening to us has a conception for what the world exists without that individual in it. That's impossible to fathom. So, and the older you get and the more you have a family or things like that, and you fall in love with things outside of yourself, you then realize, well, actually, what would bother me most about death is not being with my family. The
stakes are now high.
Yeah. So I find the focus on death, avoidance, be futile and silly. So I don't believe there is any scenario ever in which we avoid death. I am 100% in the camp that says we are all going to die. Doesn't matter how much biohacking you do, we are all going to die. So can we delay that? Yeah, I think we can. Can we delay it by 100 years? Don't think so. Can we delay it by a decade? Believe so. But I like to focus on health span. And I think that that's a real shortfall. The healthcare system today is that it focuses so much on lifespan, and it still does a lousy job extending it because it does it at such a low quality. But what I think is really good about health span is if you really focus on health span, how strong am I? How much bone density do I have? How good is my VO2 max? How metabolically flexible am I? If you focus on those things, you will get the lifespan benefits along the way. But the health span piece is actually harder. So focus on that and you get the tailwind of everything else.
How long do you think, given what we have at the moment, current human physiology, current medical advancements, all the rest of it, if someone threads the needle and manages to avoid any sort of big catastrophes, what do you reckon is the ceiling for human longevity?
Such a great question. I mean, we know obviously to date what the ceiling is, right? Which is just based on the longest lived human, which is probably 123. So we know from the study of centenarians that who do live on average, right, like 2 decades longer than the rest of us, they still succumb to the typical diseases. And if they don't, they're eventually just going to get pneumonia or something, right? So even if you don't succumb to a disease, at some point your immune system and or frailty ultimately end you. Now, I am excited about some really cool science that I think can bend the arc of those curves, right? So if you talk about frailty, sarcopenia, and you talk about immune senescence, I think there's some very interesting therapies that will occur in our lifetime that could push those things back tremendously. So again, I don't give up hope entirely that there's a way to dramatically increase lifespan, but I do find myself troubled by people who think it's going to happen on the back of like this supplement or this goofy, harebrained idea. Like depth of science that is necessary to do that. I mean, you are rewriting the entire epigenetic code to do that. Like that to me is the only way you can revert a cell back to its nascent cell. So this is not like sprinkling a few Yamanaka factors, OSKMs on a cell and just, wishing that you're going to end up with a stem cell back there. Like, no, this is very deliberate cellular reprogramming. And we clearly don't have the technology to do this yet, but it's plausible in our lifetime. And then the question is, how causal are those changes, right? That we don't know yet. We know they're correlative, right? So we know what the methylation pattern in the epigenome look like on an old T cell versus a new T cell. But what we don't know is, did those changes cause the phenotypic change? And if they did, and they did alone, and we reverse it, do we get a young T cell back again?
Yeah, so some super high dose of NMN or rapamycin or pick your compound of choice. This isn't going to be able to go in and rewrite that code.
No, there's no evidence that it will.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I think a lot about what people are trying to achieve with the longevity movement. Actually, that's one question. So you mentioned before that eventually people...
So what is it? It's funny. I really, I don't say this to be naive, but like, I don't pay attention to movements of this nature. Like what is the longevity movement? Is this really a thing?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that r/longevity is the biggest subreddit for people trying to extend their lifespan. I may have misrepresented them. It may be health span. It may be, there'll be some like very nice synopsis of it. It will be living longer and better or something like that, right? But it's a movement of people that are biohackers, health hackers in one form or another, any of whom will probably be massive fans of your work.
But, so again, if it's people who are interested in being healthier, but I was thinking more about this idea of like immortality and...
Well, I mean, Peter Diamandis has this idea of longevity escape velocity, that for every year that you stay alive, there is an amount of time that your life is extended because of improved medical stuff. And longevity escape velocity is living sufficiently long during this period that's kind of like the dark ages or the back end of the dark ages of medical advancements, so that you reach this period where you're actually able to extend it infinite.
Sure.
So that's a question that I've got. You mentioned that people in these blue zones or people that are centenarian, super long life, eventually they succumb to something. Is there such a thing as dying of just old age, or does everybody die of something?
Well, look, there are some people who we would just sort of say they just died in their sleep and there was nothing really obvious wrong. So yeah, what
is that?
Yeah, I don't know. It could be an energetic problem, right? At some point, their mitochondria literally stopped producing enough ATP for them to respire. I think
hot death.
Yeah, but I think honestly, I think many of those people are probably dying stroke or a heart attack, and we're not doing autopsies on 104-year-olds who die peacefully in their sleep. We're rejoicing them. We're thinking, God, I hope I can be so lucky.
Yes. Talk to me about the
because remember, even if you did an autopsy on someone who had a heart attack, if you didn't catch it, and depending on how long after the heart attack they die, you might not see any evidence of it in the heart muscle.
So you can show that person could have died of it, and you can show no evidence that was what caused it.
Exactly, right. So if a person is really, really old and they have, quite calcified coronary arteries with lots of plaques, it's not entirely clear that you would find the exact place where they would have had a heart attack. And whereas it's more obvious if someone has a heart attack and they live for a while, because then you have a beating heart and a piece of heart muscle that's dying, and you get a contrast between the two.
Right, I see. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And again, like I said, most of the time you're just not doing autopsies on these folks.